August 18th, 1944. 15:20 hours. Jungle clearing, New Britain, Southwest Pacific. Private First Class Kenji Watanabe crouched in the mud beneath a fallen tree, his body so weak from malnutrition that even holding his rifle required conscious effort. His unit, what remained of it, had been cut off from Japanese forces for 6 weeks. They'd survived on whatever they could find: roots, insects, leaves that made them sick but provided something to chew. 3 men had died in the last week alone, their bodies simply giving out from starvation and disease. Through the vegetation, Watanabe could hear American voices calling out in broken Japanese, "Surrender! You will not be harmed. Come out!" The 8 surviving members of his unit huddled together, facing the decision they'd been trained to avoid at all costs. They'd been taught since basic training that capture by Americans meant torture and death. Officers had been explicit. Americans were barbaric monsters who would mutilate prisoners, that death in battle was infinitely preferable to the horrors of American captivity. But they were dying anyway, slowly, painfully, from starvation and disease. At least bullets would be quick. Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto, the senior surviving soldier, made the decision. "We surrender," he whispered. "If they kill us, we die quickly. If we stay here, we die slowly. There is no third option." One by one, the Japanese soldiers crawled from their hiding places, hands raised, weapons discarded. They moved slowly, partially from the tactical caution of men expecting to be shot, partially because starvation had left them barely capable of standing. When they emerged into the clearing where American Marines waited, Watanabe closed his eyes and waited for the gunfire. Instead, he heard an American voice, calm, almost gentle. "It's okay. Nobody's going to hurt you. You're safe now." Watanabe opened his eyes. The Americans had their weapons lowered. A medic was approaching with a canteen. Another soldier was saying something into a radio. No one was pointing a gun at him. No one looked like they were preparing to torture or execute prisoners. The cognitive dissonance was so complete that Watanabe's mind struggled to process what was happening. This wasn't how capture was supposed to work. Where was the brutality? Where was the torture? Why were the Americans treating them like human beings? "Water," the medic said in terrible Japanese, extending the canteen. "Drink." Slowly. Watanabe took the canteen with shaking hands and drank. The water was clean, cool, better than anything he'd tasted in weeks. When he finished, the medic gestured for him to sit down, then began examining him for wounds and signs of disease. The gentleness of the examination shocked Watanabe almost as much as not being executed had. "We're going to feed you," an American officer was saying through an interpreter who'd materialized from somewhere. "Hot food. Real food. Then we'll get you medical treatment. You're prisoners of war now. That means you're protected under international law. Nobody's going to hurt you." Watanabe looked at his fellow prisoners. They all wore the same expression of confused disbelief. Everything they'd been taught was collapsing in real time, replaced by a reality so different from expectations that it seemed like hallucination brought on by starvation. Within an hour, the 8 Japanese prisoners were sitting on the ground near an American field kitchen, each holding a metal plate filled with hot food: rice, canned beef, bread, coffee. They ate slowly, partly because their shrunken stomachs couldn't handle rapid eating, partly because they still half expected this to be elaborate prelude to cruelty. But the cruelty never came. There was just food and water, and American soldiers who treated them with professional courtesy rather than hatred. The war wasn't over. The killing hadn't stopped. But for 8 Japanese soldiers who'd expected to die anonymously in the jungle, the discovery that enemies could show mercy created a transformation more profound than any battlefield conversion. The first meals. For Japanese prisoners experiencing their first meals in American custody, the discovery that they would be fed, and fed well, created immediate psychological crisis. Everything they'd been taught predicted starvation or poisoned food. The reality of hot, adequate meals contradicted expectations so completely that many struggled to accept what was happening. The meals themselves were standard U.S. military rations, nothing special by American standards. But, for Japanese soldiers who'd been surviving on inadequate rice rations supplemented by whatever they could forage, American military food represented abundance. The portions were larger than Japanese military rations, even during good times. The quality was better. Most striking was the reliability. Meals came on predictable schedules, rather than sporadically as Japanese logistics allowed. Private Kenji Watanabe, eating his first meal in American custody, couldn't reconcile what he was experiencing with what he'd been taught. We'd been told Americans starved prisoners deliberately, that they gave poisoned food, that capture meant slow death from hunger and disease, he recalled years later. Instead, within hours of capture, I was eating better than I'd eaten during my entire military service. The food was hot, plentiful, and nobody was taking it away or punishing us. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for them to reveal this was cruel joke before the real torture began. But it never happened. The food just kept coming, 3 times a day, more food than I could eat. The psychological impact on Japanese prisoners was immediate and profound. The contrast between propaganda predictions and actual experience created cognitive dissonance that forced re-evaluation of everything they'd been taught. If Americans were feeding them instead of starving them, what else had been lies? The propaganda of death. By mid-1944, Japanese military indoctrination about American treatment of prisoners had evolved into a systematic campaign of terror designed to prevent surrender under any circumstances. The propaganda wasn't subtle or nuanced. It was explicit horror designed to make death in battle seem preferable to capture. The conditioning was thorough and pervasive. From basic training through combat deployment, Japanese soldiers were repeatedly told that Americans tortured prisoners, that capture meant mutilation and death, that surrendering dishonored not just the individual soldier, but his entire family. The propaganda included fabricated stories of American atrocities, photographs that may or may not have been authentic, and testimony from soldiers who claimed to have witnessed American brutality. The psychological impact was profound and measurable. In Pacific battles from 1942 through 1944, Japanese forces typically fought to near annihilation rather than surrendering. Combat after combat saw Japanese casualties of 95% or higher, with only a tiny fraction taken prisoner, usually those too wounded or unconscious to resist capture or commit suicide. The willingness to die rather than surrender was partly cultural, partly tactical, but significantly driven by genuine terror of what capture would mean. By 1944, as American forces advanced across the Pacific, they were capturing increasing numbers of Japanese soldiers, not because Japanese surrender rates increased, but because the scale of combat operations meant more Japanese found themselves cut off, wounded, or too weak from disease and starvation to continue fighting. The prisoners taken were often in desperate physical condition, having resisted capture until physical incapacity made continued resistance impossible. The Japanese prisoners arriving in American custody carried deep-seated terror about their fate. Many expected immediate execution. Others anticipated torture and mutilation. Some believed Americans would use them for medical experiments or forced labor in conditions worse than death. The propaganda had been so thorough that even after capture, many prisoners waited for days or weeks for the promised horrors to begin. The POW camp system. American POW camps established throughout the Pacific Theater and later in Japan created controlled environments where Japanese prisoners experienced sustained exposure to American values and organizational competence. The camps weren't luxury facilities. They were military installations designed for security and efficiency. But compared to what Japanese prisoners expected or had experienced in their own military service, the camps represented dramatic improvement. The camps provided regular meals on fixed schedules. 3 times daily, every prisoner received adequate food, not luxurious, but sufficient to maintain health and gradually restore weight to malnourished prisoners. The predictability was as important as the quantity. Japanese soldiers accustomed to sporadic rations that arrived when logistics allowed discovered that American supply systems delivered food reliably regardless of conditions. Medical care in the camps exceeded what many Japanese soldiers had received while serving their own military. American medical personnel treated POWs for malnutrition, tropical diseases, wounds, and chronic conditions. By late 1944, approximately 30% of Japanese POWs required immediate medical treatment for conditions including malaria, dysentery, beriberi, and combat wounds. American medical facilities treated these conditions systematically, providing medications, particularly anti-malarial drugs and antibiotics, that Japanese forces often lacked entirely. The survival rate for Japanese POWs in American custody exceeded 98%, compared to approximately 70 to 75% survival rates for Japanese soldiers receiving medical care in their own military hospitals during the same period. Sanitation in the camps represented another stark contrast with Japanese military experience. American forces provided clean water, latrines, bathing facilities, and regular clothing changes. The systematic attention to hygiene prevented disease spread and improved health outcomes. Japanese prisoners accustomed to field conditions where dysentery and other sanitation-related diseases were endemic found themselves in an environment where such diseases were rare. The breaking of expectations. For Japanese prisoners, the sustained experience of American custody initiated psychological transformation that propaganda couldn't survive. Daily evidence that Americans weren't torturing them, weren't starving them, weren't treating them as subhuman. This accumulating evidence forced re-evaluation of everything they'd been taught. The transformation didn't happen uniformly or universally. Some prisoners remained committed to imperial ideology despite evidence. Others experienced psychological crisis as their worldview collapsed. Most fell somewhere between, gradually acknowledging that propaganda had been false while struggling to construct new understanding of their situation. The process was accelerated by specific experiences that contradicted propaganda with particular force. Medical care was especially significant. Prisoners who'd expected to be left to die from wounds or disease instead received treatment that saved their lives. The cognitive dissonance of having one's life saved by people propaganda claimed were monsters created powerful challenges to indoctrination. Food sharing created similar effects. Japanese prisoners watching American soldiers eat the same rations they received undermined propaganda claims about Americans viewing Japanese as subhuman. The equality of rations, guards and prisoners eating the same food, demonstrated respect for prisoner dignity that contradicted propaganda predictions. Corporal Hiroshi Tanaka, captured on Peleliu in November 1944, described his psychological evolution. First week, I waited to be tortured. Second week, I waited to be starved. Third week, I began accepting that neither was happening. By the second month, I had to face the truth. Everything we'd been taught about Americans was lies. They fed us, treated our sick, provided shelter and clothing. They treated us better than our own officers had. That realization was painful because it meant I'd fought for lies, that my friends had died for propaganda. But it was also liberating because it meant I could survive with honor rather than dying for nothing. The cultural exchange. Despite language barriers and the inherent tensions of captor-prisoner relationships, American personnel and Japanese POWs developed limited cultural exchanges that humanized both sides. The interactions ranged from purely functional communication about camp operations to genuine attempts at mutual understanding. Language learning happened organically. American guards learned basic Japanese phrases necessary for camp management. Japanese prisoners learned English words and phrases, often eagerly since English proficiency improved their ability to navigate camp life. The language exchange created foundation for deeper communication. Food became medium for cultural bridge building. Japanese prisoners would sometimes prepare traditional dishes using available ingredients, sharing them with curious American personnel. Americans would explain American foods that were novel to Japanese prisoners: processed cheese, canned fruits, coffee prepared American style. The culinary exchanges were simple but meaningful. Recreation activities created common ground. Baseball was particularly significant, a sport popular in both cultures that required no language to play. POW camps often had baseball games where American guards and Japanese prisoners competed, the game creating space where enmity could be temporarily suspended in favor of athletic competition. Some American personnel made conscious efforts to treat prisoners with dignity that went beyond minimum requirements. They'd share cigarettes, show photographs of their families, attempt conversations using limited shared vocabulary. These gestures of humanity weren't universal. Some American personnel maintained strict distance from prisoners, but they were common enough to influence camp atmosphere significantly. The systematic contrast. The experience of Japanese POWs in American custody created stark contrast with treatment of Allied POWs held by Japanese forces. The comparison highlighted fundamental differences in values, organizational capacity, and respect for international law. Allied prisoners held by Japanese forces experienced systematic brutality, starvation rations, forced labor, medical neglect, and deliberate cruelty. The death rate for Allied POWs in Japanese custody approached 27%. More than 1 in 4 prisoners died during captivity. The causes were systematic: inadequate food, no medical care, deliberate abuse, forced labor under brutal conditions, and sometimes outright murder. Japanese POWs in American custody experienced the opposite. The death rate was under 2%, with most deaths attributable to diseases contracted before capture or wounds sustained in combat prior to surrender. American forces provided adequate food, medical care, shelter, and generally humane treatment. The contrast wasn't subtle. It was stark difference between systems that respected human dignity and systems that didn't. The comparison influenced post-war Japanese understanding of American character and democratic values. Japanese soldiers who survived American captivity could testify that Americans had treated them far better than Japanese forces had treated Allied prisoners. This testimony created moral foundation for Japanese acceptance of American occupation and influence during post-war Reconstruction. The camp operations. The daily functioning of POW camps documented American organizational capacity applied to humanitarian purposes. The camps operated as small cities requiring food service, sanitation, medical care, security, administration, and recreation facilities for populations ranging from hundreds to thousands of prisoners. The food service operations were particularly complex. Camp mess facilities prepared 3 meals daily for entire prisoner populations, plus American Guard forces. The menus were planned to provide adequate calories and nutrition while considering available supplies and cultural preferences when possible. Rice was included when available since it was familiar to Japanese prisoners. American foods were provided when rice was scarce. The systematic provision of adequate food demonstrated organizational competence that few military forces could match. Medical facilities in larger camps rivaled small hospitals in their capabilities. They included surgical facilities, isolation wards for infectious diseases, dental services, and pharmaceutical supplies. American medical personnel treated prisoners with the same standard of care they'd provide to American military personnel, administering antibiotics, antimalarials, and other medications that Japanese military often lacked. The administrative systems tracked prisoner identities, medical conditions, work assignments, and correspondence with families. The record-keeping served security purposes, but also ensured each prisoner received proper treatment and could be located for repatriation. The bureaucratic thoroughness reflected broader American approach to military operations that emphasized systematic organization. The unexpected gratitude. Perhaps the most striking aspect of Japanese POW experience was the gratitude many felt toward their captors, a sentiment that contradicted every expectation about how prisoners should feel about enemies who'd defeated them. The gratitude was expressed in various ways. Some prisoners volunteered for work details beyond what was required, wanting to contribute something in return for food and care they received. Others learned English specifically to thank American personnel. Some wrote letters, not for delivery, but for their own records, expressing appreciation for treatment that had saved their lives. The gratitude was compliments. The documentation served medical purposes, but also provided evidence of American adherence to international law regarding prisoner treatment. The closing truth. The story of Japanese POWs who expected starvation and instead received hot meals and kindness documented more than successful implementation of international law regarding prisoner treatment. It demonstrated that even in total war's brutality, systematic humanity remained possible for nations and militaries that valued it. The Japanese soldiers who surrendered expecting death and found life instead experienced transformation that propaganda couldn't survive and that cultural indoctrination couldn't overcome. The daily evidence of American humanity: meals served on schedule, medical care provided without hesitation, dignity maintained despite captivity, created reality that contradicted every prediction and forced re-evaluation of everything they'd been taught. For American forces, feeding and caring for enemy prisoners required resources that could have been used for other purposes. It demanded sustained commitment during period when American forces were stretched thin across Pacific. It meant treating enemies humanely when reciprocal treatment of Allied prisoners by Japanese forces was brutal and inhumane. But the American forces maintained the policy because it reflected values worth defending, that human dignity transcended nationality, that enemies remained human beings deserving of basic care, that victory could be achieved without abandoning civilization's core principles. The hot meals served to starving Japanese prisoners, the medical care provided to sick enemies, the basic kindness shown to men complicated by cultural expectations about honor and obligation. Japanese military culture taught that capture was ultimate dishonor, that accepting help from enemies was shameful. But the practical reality that Americans had saved their lives created obligation that many prisoners felt compelled to acknowledge despite cultural prohibitions against feeling gratitude toward enemies. Staff Sergeant Frank Morrison, who supervised prisoner work details at a camp in the Philippines, observed the dynamic. These guys would work harder than we asked them to. They'd volunteer for extra duties. They'd try to thank us in broken English. You could tell they were struggling with feeling grateful to people they'd been trained to hate. But the gratitude was genuine. They knew we'd saved them when we could have let them die. That recognition created something between us that transcended the enemy relationship. The medical recoveries. The physical transformations of Japanese POWs during American custody documented both the severity of their condition at capture and the effectiveness of adequate nutrition and medical care. Prisoners who arrived skeletal and diseased gained significant weight within months of regular feeding. The average weight gain for severely malnourished prisoners during first 3 months of adequate rations was approximately 25 to 35 pounds. Men who'd weighed 90–100 pounds at capture, dangerously underweight for adult males, would reach 115–135 pounds after sustained adequate feeding. The weight gain represented not just fat storage, but muscle development and general health restoration. Medical conditions that had been chronic and debilitating responded to treatment that Japanese military hadn't provided. Malaria cases came under control with anti-malarial drugs. Dysentery resolved with antibiotics and improved sanitation. Beriberi symptoms improved dramatically with thiamine supplementation. Dental work addressed infections and decay that had caused chronic pain. The medical recoveries were documented through routine health assessments that tracked prisoners' progress. American medical personnel kept records showing weight gains, disease resolutions, and general health improvement who'd been trying to kill Americans days earlier. All demonstrated that mercy could survive mechanized warfare and that democracy's strength included capacity to treat defeated enemies with humanity rather than revenge. The Japanese POWs who ate American food, who received American medical care, who experienced American organizational competence and basic human decency, they survived to carry those memories through post-war reconstruction. Their survival and their experiences created foundation for understanding that former enemies could become partners, that mercy was stronger than propaganda, and that sometimes the most powerful victories are measured not in battles won, but in lives saved and dignity preserved.